10:14 a.m., Lexington, Kentucky. The conference room smelled faintly of paper and old polish. The chairs were arranged too neatly, like they expected good behavior. Sunlight filtered through half-closed blinds, landing in pale stripes across the long table. I folded my hands in my lap and waited. Across from me, my son leaned back in his chair, one ankle resting on his knee, already comfortable, already certain. When the attorney cleared his throat and opened the folder, Robert let out a small laugh. Not loud, not cruel, just amused. "Well," he said, shaking his head lightly, "this shouldn't take long." The corners of his mouth lifted, confident, dismissive, as if my life had already been summarized. I kept my eyes on the grain of the table, tracing the lines with quiet focus. My heart wasn't racing. It felt steady, almost distant. I noticed the soft hum of the air vent, the scratch of the lawyer's pen as he adjusted his notes. Small sounds, grounding sounds. Robert glanced at me, still smiling. "Mom always liked things simple," he added. "Didn't you?" I nodded once politely. Simple, yes, careless, never. The attorney began reading, his voice even and practiced. Legal language filled the room, measured, calm. Robert shifted forward, interest sharpening as each sentence confirmed what he believed he already owned. I could feel his certainty growing, settling into the space between us like it belonged there. I sat very still. I had learned long ago that stillness makes people underestimate you. As page 1 came to an end, Robert exhaled through his nose, satisfied. He looked at the attorney, then back at me, already preparing to stand. "See?" he said softly. "Just like I said." The attorney turned the page. And for the first time that morning, Robert stopped smiling. Long pause, ones, 10:17 a.m., Lexington, Kentucky. The room grew quieter without anyone asking it to. As the attorney continued, I felt the temperature shift not in the air, but in the attention. The easy confidence Robert carried only moments ago had begun to thin, like a smile held too long. He leaned back again, crossing his arms, though this time it looked less relaxed and more guarded. I kept my posture composed, my hands still folded. This is not the moment, I reminded myself. The moment comes later. For now, I listened. The attorney's voice remained neutral, steady in a way that suggested discipline, not comfort. He read carefully, pausing at commas, giving each sentence the space it deserved. Words like conditional, supplemental, and subsequent provisions drifted across the table. Robert frowned slightly, as if the language had stopped cooperating with his expectations. He glanced at me again. I met his eyes briefly, then looked away. Not out of fear, out of habit. I had spent years perfecting the art of not reacting when reaction would only invite interruption. Let him assume, I thought. Assumption is heavy. It slows people down. The blinds rattled softly as a truck passed outside. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed, ordinary sounds, continuing without regard for what was unfolding in this small, contained room. That steadied me. Robert shifted in his seat. "This is all standard stuff, right?" He forced a light tone. The attorney didn't look up. "We'll proceed in order," he replied simply. Order. That word, settled something in me. I had lived my life in order, quietly, deliberately, long before anyone thought to read it aloud. What Robert heard as delay, I recognized as structure. The attorney reached the bottom of the page again. His fingers adjusted the paper. Page 2 waited. Long pause once. 10:19 a.m., Lexington, Kentucky. Memory has a way of arriving uninvited. As the attorney adjusted his papers, my thoughts moved backward without effort, not suddenly, deliberately. 30 years of living doesn't rush when called upon. It waits until you are quiet enough to listen. I remembered the early years after my husband passed. The farm was still ours then, though ours meant me alone. Bills arrived on time. Crops did not always cooperate. I learned quickly how to read contracts by lamplight, how to ask questions without sounding unsure, how to sign my name only after every line made sense. Survival teaches you precision. Robert was young then, confident, impatient. He wanted faster answers, bigger risks. I wanted steadiness. We argued, not loudly, but often. I taught him that land lasts longer than excitement, that money moves quietly when handled well. He listened sometimes. Other times he smiled and waited for me to finish talking, already certain he knew better. Over the years, I documented everything, not because I distrusted my son, but because I respected the work it takes to build something that can be taken apart by carelessness. Deeds, accounts, notes written in the margins explaining why decisions were made. That habit never left me. I glanced at Robert now, sitting across the polished table. He looked comfortable, as if the room belonged to him already. He thinks inheritance is automatic, I realized. That time alone confers ownership. The attorney cleared his throat softly, pulling me back into the present. What Robert had never understood, what I never corrected him on, was this: I did not prepare my life for ease. I prepared it for accuracy, and accuracy was about to matter. Long pause. 10:24 a.m., Lexington, Kentucky. Confidence can sound like certainty. Robert had always known how to fill a room without raising his voice. Even as a boy, he spoke with assurance, the kind that made adults nod along before realizing they hadn't actually agreed to anything. Over the years, that habit sharpened. Confidence became assumption. Assumption became expectation. I noticed it first in small ways. He would answer questions meant for me. "Mom doesn't need to worry about that," he'd say, smiling easily. Or, "She prefers I handle the details." Each time the words sounded reasonable, helpful even. And because I valued peace, I often let them pass. Don't make a scene, I told myself. This isn't important enough. But it kept happening. Documents began arriving, addressed jointly, though I had never requested the change. Appointments shifted without my handwriting on the calendar. When I asked, Robert waved it off. "Just simplifying things," he said. "You've earned a break." His tone was warm, almost proud, like someone offering relief instead of control. What unsettled me wasn't what he did. It was how certain he was that I wouldn't object. At family gatherings, He spoke about the future as if it were already assigned. When everything's settled, he'd say, glancing around the room, "I'll make sure the land stays productive." No one corrected him. I didn't either. Silence, after all, can sound like agreement when people are eager enough to hear it that way. Sitting now at the will reading, I recognized that same posture, the relaxed shoulders, the faint smile. He believed this moment was confirmation, not discovery. The attorney turned another page, and for the first time, I wondered not what Robert expected to receive, but how far he'd already gone to secure it. Long pause. Once. 10:31 a.m., Lexington, Kentucky. The first betrayal didn't announce itself. The attorney adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. The soft scrape of paper echoed louder than it should have. Robert leaned back in his chair, one ankle resting casually over his knee. He wasn't watching the attorney. He was watching me, briefly, confidently, like someone waiting for a performance they already knew the ending to. This section outlines the transfer of decision-making authority, the attorney said evenly. I frowned. Transfer? I hadn't transferred anything. He continued reading, voice steady, precise. Medical proxies, financial oversight, temporary authority that had somehow stretched across years without my noticing. Each phrase landed gently, professionally, but together they formed a shape I didn't recognize. I turned my head slightly toward Robert. He didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked relieved. You knew about this, I said quietly. Not an accusation, an observation. He smiled, small, indulgent. Mom, it was just paperwork. You signed things all the time back then. You trusted me. Trusted. The word settled heavily in my chest. I don't remember agreeing to this, I said. That's because it wasn't a big deal, he replied quickly. It was for convenience. Doctors, banks, emergencies. You didn't want to be bothered. The room felt warmer suddenly. The air thick with something unspoken. I searched my memory, not for confusion, but for certainty. I had kept records my entire life, lists, dates, notes in margins. And yet, here was my name attached to decisions I had never made. The attorney paused. Mrs. Holloway, he asked gently, do you recall authorizing this arrangement? I opened my mouth, then closed it, because in that moment I understood something Robert had counted on, not forgetfulness, assumption. He believed my silence over the years had been permission, and sitting there, listening to my life summarized by someone else's choices, I felt the first clear fracture form. This wasn't misunderstanding. It was the first betrayal. Long pause, 1.0. 11:04 a.m., Lexington, Kentucky. The second betrayal surfaced quietly. The attorney turned a page. The sound was dry, deliberate. Robert shifted forward now, elbows on the table. His confidence settled back into place, as if the interruption had passed. I noticed how comfortable he looked, how practiced. That, more than anything, unsettled me. This next portion addresses asset management, the attorney said. Specifically, discretionary control exercised on behalf of Mrs. Holloway. On behalf of. The phrase felt carefully chosen. He read on, accounts consolidated, properties streamlined. Small decisions framed as efficiency. Larger ones justified as necessity. Each sentence sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they told a story where my absence had been convenient. I felt my pulse steady, not race. Pay attention, I told myself. This is where clarity matters. When did this happen? I asked. Robert answered before the attorney could. Over time, he said easily. After Dad passed, you didn't want to deal with all that stress. I turned to him fully. I dealt with every bill. I said, every repair, every tax form. He waved a hand, almost gently. Exactly, it was too much. I stepped in, as if invited. The attorney glanced between us. Mrs. Holloway, he said carefully, many of these actions require explicit consent. Signatures, confirmations. Robert's jaw tightened. She gave consent, he said quickly. She just doesn't remember every detail. There it was. The shape of it. Not concern, not help. Replacement. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked down at the document in front of me, my name printed neatly at the top, and I felt something settle into place. If Robert believed memory was my weakness, then record would be my strength, and I already knew where to begin looking. Long pause as 11:32 a.m., Lexington, Kentucky. The third betrayal revealed the intent. The room felt warmer than before. The air thicker, as if the walls themselves were listening. The attorney paused, then adjusted his glasses. There is also a medical notation, he said, included as supporting context. I looked up. Medical? Robert didn't meet my eyes. The attorney read carefully. It states that Mrs. Holloway was experiencing periods of confusion and fatigue, and that decision-making support was recommended. Confusion. The word landed softly and cut cleanly. That's not true, I said. My voice surprised me with its steadiness. Robert leaned back, folding his arms. Mom, he said, patient, practiced. You were overwhelmed. You said so yourself. I said I was tired, I replied. There's a difference. The attorney turned another page. These notes appear to have been submitted informally, he said. There's no physician's signature. No signature. Just a suggestion. A story. I understood then what Robert had been building, not just control over assets, but a narrative that made my absence reasonable. If I was confused, then decisions could be made for me. If I was tired, then consent could be assumed. I felt something inside me harden, not anger. Not fear, resolve. When was I told this was written? Robert hesitated, just a beat too long. It was for your protection, he said. You didn't need to worry about it. I nodded once. Slowly. This is the line, I thought. I reached into my bag and felt the familiar edge of my leather notebook. Its weight steadied me. Years of dates, receipts, notes written in my own hand. I'm not confused, I said quietly, and I'm not absent. The attorney looked at me then, not as a form, not as a subject, but as the center of the room. I opened the notebook on the table, and for the first time that morning, Robert stopped smiling. Long pause, once. 12:04 p.m., Lexington, Kentucky. Aftermath settles, determination forms. The room didn't erupt after I opened the notebook. No gasps, no arguments. Just a quiet recalibration, like a scale adjusting its weight. The attorney leaned forward slightly, eyes on the pages I had kept for years. Dates aligned, notes written in the same steady hand. Margins filled with context only a life lived carefully could provide. Robert shifted in his chair. The confidence he'd carried into the room began to thin. Not all at once, but enough for me to notice. He tapped his foot once, then stopped. These are contemporaneous records, the attorney said, almost to himself. Consistent, detailed. I closed the notebook gently. I hadn't brought it to prove a point. I brought it because I knew who I was. I don't want to argue, I said. I want clarity. The attorney nodded. That's reasonable. Robert finally looked at me. Mom, he began, softer now. We can talk about this later. Later? The word people use when they want time to rearrange the story. No, I replied. Calm. Certain. We'll talk about it properly. Silence followed. Chosen, not imposed. I gathered my bag. The leather notebook returned to its place like a tool that had done its job for now. My hands were steady. That surprised me less than it should have. As I stood, I felt the shift inside me complete. This wasn't reaction, it wasn't hurt. It was decision. The attorney cleared his throat. Given what's been raised, he said, the next step is formal review. Robert inhaled sharply. I didn't look at him as I walked toward the door. The hallway felt cooler, clearer. Each step carried me out of the role he'd assigned me and back into my own. Let the record speak, I thought, and for the first time, it would. Long pause, ones. 2:18 p.m., Lexington, Kentucky. Preparation begins quietly. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I sat in my car engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, letting the moment settle. Behind me, the courthouse steps echoed with other people's urgency. Doors opening. Voices rising. But inside the car, there was only stillness. Preparation doesn't announce itself, I reminded myself. It listens first. I drove home and laid everything out on the dining table. The notebook. Old statements, copies of letters I'd never thrown away. Each page told the same story, just in a different tone. Receipts instead of feelings. Dates instead of arguments. I wasn't angry. As I worked, I was methodical. That felt important. I made the call before doubt could interrupt me. The attorney's assistant answered, efficient, calm, and scheduled a formal review for the following week. No drama, no promises, just process. When I hung up, I noticed my shoulders had lowered on their own. That evening, Robert sent a message. Let's not make this complicated. I read it once, then set the phone face down. Complication thrives on conversation. Clarity thrives on records. I returned to the table and added one more entry to the notebook, short, factual. Post-reading communications attempted. Nothing else. No interpretation. The truth doesn't need embellishment. As the sun slid lower, the house filled with amber light. I brewed tea and sat quietly, listening to the familiar creak of the floorboards. This life had always responded to care, not control. Tomorrow, the paperwork would begin to move. Files requested, timelines confirmed. I didn't need to push. Let preparation do what it does best, I thought. And somewhere beyond my walls, the balance was already starting to shift. Long pause, 1.0s, 9:06 a.m., Lexington, Kentucky. The first shift. The call came sooner than I expected. I was standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing a cup I hadn't finished, when my phone vibrated against the counter. I let it buzz once longer than necessary. Answering too fast feels like asking permission, I thought. Then I picked up. "Mrs. Holloway," the attorney said, measured clear. "We've completed a preliminary review." I dried my hands slowly, the towel rough and familiar. "I'm listening," I said. He spoke in careful steps, documents cross-checked, signatures compared, timelines aligned. Nothing accusatory. Nothing emotional. Just facts laid side by side, until patterns began to speak for themselves. As he listed them, a calm settled over me. The kind that arrives when uncertainty finally has a shape. "There's a discrepancy we need to address," he continued. "And until it's resolved, certain assumptions can't stand." Assumptions, the word felt precise, necessary. I thanked him and ended the call. The kitchen felt brighter than it had moments before. Sunlight catching the rim of the sink. I stood there, breathing evenly, letting the quiet confirm what I already knew. This was no longer about family dynamics. It was about records. Minutes later, another vibration. "Robert." This time, a voicemail. I didn't listen. I didn't need to. The tone would be familiar. Concern, dressed as reason. Urgency, framed as care. Not today, I thought. An email followed. Subject line plain and unmistakable. Formal notice initiated. I read it once, then again. Each word held steady. I set the phone down and opened my notebook, turning to a clean page. The pen paused, then moved. Notice issued. Review underway. The turning point isn't loud, I realized. It's official. And now, there would be witnesses. 10:18 a.m., Lexington, Kentucky. The reveal begins. The meeting room was smaller than I expected. Clean walls, a long table, polished enough to reflect the ceiling lights. Nothing dramatic. That felt intentional. Drama distracts. Records don't. I arrived early and took the chair nearest the window, setting my purse at my feet. My hands rested in my lap, calm. This is what readiness feels like, I thought. Not excitement. Not fear, just steadiness. Robert came in, smiling, too relaxed. He nodded at me the way people do when they believe something is already decided. I returned the nod politely. Nothing more. The attorney began without preamble. "This review concerns discrepancies identified in the estate documents," he said. Pages were turned. The sound was soft but unmistakable. Each one felt like a step forward. He read aloud dates, signatures, transfers. Then he paused. "Page 2, he said, and lifted his eyes. Robert shifted in his chair. "That page," the attorney continued, "contains a conditional clause that was never disclosed during the initial reading." He slid the document across the table, stopping it squarely in front of my son. "It alters beneficiary authority pending verification." Silence filled the room. Not awkward, but exact. Robert laughed once. Short, automatic. Then stopped when no one joined him. "That doesn't change anything," he said. "It's procedural." The attorney didn't argue. He simply tapped the page. "It changes everything." I watched my son read. Watched the confidence drain from his posture. as lines he had never bothered to read finally demanded his attention. Assumption has a sound when it breaks, I thought. It's very quiet. For the record, the attorney said, Mrs. Holloway retains full authority until review concludes. I nodded once. That was all. The room had corrected itself, and Robert was only just beginning to understand what page 2 meant. 11:02 a.m., Lexington, Kentucky. When the room listens. The second meeting was larger, longer table, more chairs filled. The kind of room chosen when outcomes are no longer private. I took my seat without hesitation. My coat folded neatly over my arm. My posture surprised me. Upright, unguarded. This is what it feels like when you stop bracing, I thought. Robert arrived late. The door opened sharply, cutting through a low murmur. He paused, eyes scanning the room as if counting witnesses. I noticed the brief hitch in his step before he recovered and took his seat across from me. He did not look at me. That, too, felt telling. The lead attorney began calmly, outlining findings without emotion. Unauthorized assumptions, incomplete disclosures, reliance on silence instead of consent. Each point landed cleanly, unadorned. Facts don't need force when they're documented. Then she turned to me. Mrs. Holloway, she said, would you like to clarify your position for the record? I stood slowly. The chair slid back, a soft sound that carried farther than I expected. I didn't look at my son. I looked at the table, at the people who had asked me to speak. I was not informed. I said, I was not consulted. And I did not agree. My voice held. Silence. I continued. Was mistaken for permission. Robert leaned forward. I was acting in her best interest. He said quickly. I was trying to simplify things. The attorney met his gaze. Intent, she said evenly, does not replace consent, and simplification does not justify exclusion. No one spoke after that. The conclusion followed, formal, precise. Authority restricted. Oversight assigned. Conditions activated. The language was procedural, but the effect was unmistakable. I sat down slowly. The truth doesn't raise its voice. I realized it only needs the room to listen. Across the table, Robert stared at his hands. And for the first time, the story was no longer being told around me. 2:48 p.m., Lexington, Kentucky. Consequences arrive quietly. The decision did not come with raised voices, no dramatic pauses. It arrived the way real consequences often do. Calmly. Carried by careful language that left no room for interpretation. Authority previously assumed by Robert Holloway was formally restricted. Oversight reassigned. Conditions imposed. Each sentence was neutral. Together, they were final. Robert did not speak. He stared at the table as if the grain of the wood might offer an explanation. The confidence he carried into the room had nowhere to settle now. No argument followed. No appeal. He gathered his papers, movements smaller than before, and stood without looking in my direction. I remained seated, after the room began to empty. The quiet that followed felt earned. Justice doesn't announce itself, I thought. It aligns things. The consequences unfolded in practical ways. Notices were sent, names adjusted, roles clarified. Where Robert's signature once appeared automatically, it no longer did. Where decisions had been made on my behalf, they now came to me directly, unfiltered, unsoftened. No one explained the change. They didn't need to. The system had corrected itself. Weeks later, the social consequences followed. At a family gathering, Robert kept his distance. Polite, careful, reduced to courtesy. No apology arrived, no explanation was offered, and in that space between us, I understood something important. The consequence was not humiliation. It was irrelevance. Control dissolves quickly when it's no longer assumed. People adjust when certainty disappears. Conversations recalibrate. Authority, once questioned, does not return quietly. That evening, I returned home and placed the old envelope back into its drawer. I didn't linger. It had done what it was meant to do. Not as proof of victory, but as evidence of truth. Some downfalls are loud. Others happen when the room simply stops deferring. And this one, I knew, was permanent. 6:34 p.m., Lexington, Kentucky. Healing does not rush. It settles. That evening, the house felt different. Not quieter, just calmer. As if something that had been pressing against the walls for months had finally stepped outside and closed the door behind it. I moved through the room slowly, turning on lamps one by one. Warm light filled corners that had felt tense and watchful. My shoulders lowered without my asking. That's how you know something has ended, I thought. In the kitchen, I made a simple supper. Soup simmered gently, the spoon tapping the pot in an unhurried rhythm. Steam fogged my glasses. I laughed softly as I wiped them clean. The sound surprised me, not because it was loud, but because it was easy. I'm still here, I realized, still capable, still myself. I sat at the table alone, but the loneliness I had feared never arrived. Instead, there was space, room to breathe without being managed, without being interpreted. The drawer beside me stayed closed. The envelope inside had done its work. I didn't need to touch it again. The shame I hadn't known I was carrying began to loosen. Those quiet suggestions about age, about needing help, about stepping aside. Not because they were argued away, but because they no longer fit. Healing, I learned, doesn't erase what happened. It places it properly. So it stops crowding the present. Later, I stepped onto the porch. Evening air, cool, clean. A neighbor waved. I returned it without thinking. Ordinary moments felt precious again. Inside, I turned off the lights and let the house settle. It felt like mine, not by decree, but by belonging. Healing hadn't arrived with fanfare. It waited until I was ready to notice it. 7:02 a.m., Lexington, Kentucky. Some mornings are earned. Morning arrived without urgency. Pale light slipped through the kitchen window and rested on the table where so much of my life had quietly unfolded. I poured my coffee and stood for a moment, listening, not for footsteps, not for voices, but for myself. The house answered in familiar ways. The soft tick of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the curtain shifting with the breeze. Nothing demanded anything from me. I sat and wrapped my hands around the mug, letting the warmth settle. Small details came back into focus. The faint scratch along the table's edge, the chair's gentle creak, the smell of coffee mixing with clean air. These were the things that had always mattered. They were still here, and so was I. For a long time, I believed dignity meant enduring quietly, that silence was the price of peace, that asking questions made you difficult. I had worn that belief carefully. But I learned something different. Silence only has power when it's chosen. When it's a tool, not a cage. I thought about how easily a voice can be misplaced. Not taken, not shouted down, just set aside. How age is mistaken for absence. How systems depend on people stepping back politely. I had nearly done that myself. Not from weakness, but from habit. I opened the drawer and touched the envelope one last time. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Some tools finish their work and deserve their rest. So do people. If there is one truth I will carry forward, it is this. Age does not make you invisible. Calm does not make you weak. And patience, paired with truth, can undo even the quietest control. I turned off the light and stepped into the day, carrying nothing but myself. And that was enough.